The bitter Montana wind howled through the mountains, carrying with it a promise of the harshest winter Silverline Creek had seen in decades. Sarah Evans pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stoked the fire in her small cabin, the flames dancing and casting long shadows across the rough-hewn walls. The year was 1879, and she had been alone in this wilderness for 8 months now, ever since her father had succumbed to pneumonia, leaving her with nothing but this cabin, his hunting rifle, and a stubborn determination to make it on her own. The blizzard had been raging for 3 days, piling snow against her cabin walls like a fortress of white. Sarah wasn't afraid she'd weathered storms before, but something about this one felt different, more ominous. The timbers groaned under the weight above, a sound she'd never heard before. Sarah moved to the window, wiping away the frost with her sleeve. Outside, the world had disappeared under a blanket of white. The forest that normally stood as sentinels around her cabin was nothing but ghostly silhouettes against the driving snow. Her nearest neighbor was 10 miles away, too far to reach in this weather, even if she could find her way. She turned back to her modest supplies. There was enough food to last another week, maybe 2 if she was careful. The firewood was stacked high beside the hearth, and she had melted snow for water. She would be fine, she told herself. She just had to wait it out, but as night fell, the sounds of the cabin changed. The creaking grew louder, more persistent. Sarah lay awake on her small bed, listening to the storm rage and the wood protest. Then, around midnight, there was a sharp crack like a gunshot from somewhere above her head. Sarah bolted upright, her heart hammering. Another crack followed, then another. She barely had time to grab her father's coat and a blanket before the center beam split with a sound like thunder. The roof began to cave, snow pouring in like a waterfall of white. Sarah scrambled toward the door, but she wasn't fast enough. The last thing she felt was the crushing weight of timber and snow before darkness claimed her miles away. Kyle Dawson pulled his hat lower against the stinging snow as he urged his horse forward through the drifts. He hadn't planned on being caught in this storm, but a delayed delivery in Butte had set him back 3 days. Now he was paying the price, struggling through what felt like the end of the world itself. Kyle was no stranger to harsh conditions. At 32, he'd spent more than half his life working cattle drives, breaking horses, and delivering mail to the most remote parts of the territory. The scars on his weathered face and calloused hands told the story of a man who'd faced down nature's fury more times than he could count. He knew he needed shelter soon. His horse, Thunder, was struggling, the animal's breath coming in labored clouds of vapor. The temperature had dropped dangerously low, and even with his heavy coat, Kyle could feel the cold seeping into his bones. He remembered a cabin in these parts, a man named Evans and his daughter. Kyle had stopped there once before, nearly a year ago, when he'd been delivering a package. Evans had been a gruff sort, but his daughter had offered him coffee and cornbread with a smile that had stayed with Kyle for weeks afterward. "Just a little further, boy," Kyle murmured to Thunder, squinting through the snow. He wasn't sure he could find the cabin in these conditions, but it was his best hope. It was nearly dawn when Kyle spotted a break in the trees that looked familiar. He guided Thunder forward, hope rising in his chest, but as he approached, that hope turned to dread. Where the cabin should have been was now just a mound of snow and broken timber, the collapse still fresh enough that snow hadn't completely covered the wreckage. "God Almighty," Kyle whispered, dismounting quickly and tying Thunder to a nearby tree. He slogged through the deep snow to what remained of the cabin, calling out as he approached. "Hello, anyone there? Evans?" There was no response but the howling of the wind. Kyle surveyed the damage with a sinking heart. The roof had completely caved in and one wall had collapsed outward. It would take a miracle for anyone to have survived this, still he had to try. Kyle began digging with his bare hands, tossing aside chunks of snow and splintered wood. "Hello," he called again, his voice raw against the wind. "Anyone alive in there?" He worked frantically, ignoring the biting cold that numbed his fingers. After what felt like hours but was likely only minutes, he uncovered part of the cabin's interior, a table, smashed nearly flat, and beside it, a glimpse of fabric. Kyle redoubled his efforts, clearing away debris until he revealed a woman's form, partially buried under a fallen beam. Her face was deathly pale, a thin trickle of blood frozen on her temple, but Kyle recognized her immediately, the Evans girl. Carefully, Kyle lifted the beam off her and brushed away the snow from her face. Her lips had taken on a bluish tint, and for a moment he thought he was too late. Then he saw the faintest cloud of breath in the frigid air. Relief washed over him. "You're breathing," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "That's enough." Working quickly, Kyle wrapped her in the blanket she'd somehow managed to grab before the collapse. He needed to get her warm and fast. The nearest town was too far in this weather, she'd never survive the journey. With careful movements, he lifted her from the wreckage, cradling her against his chest. Thunder nickered nervously as Kyle approached with Sarah in his arms. "It's all right, boy," Kyle soothed. "We've got precious cargo now." Kyle knew these mountains well enough to remember a line shack about 2 miles east, a simple shelter used by ranchers when moving cattle. If it was still standing, it might provide enough protection to save both their lives. With Sarah secured in front of him on the saddle, Kyle urged Thunder forward into the storm once more. The woman remained unconscious, but he could feel her shallow breathing against his chest, a rhythm he found himself counting, willing it to continue. The journey to the line shack was arduous. The snow had drifted higher in some places, forcing Thunder to high-step his way forward. Kyle kept one arm firmly around Sarah, praying silently that she would hold on. When the simple wooden structure of the line shack finally emerged from the white landscape, Kyle nearly wept with relief. He dismounted carefully, keeping Sarah in his arms, and kicked the door open. The interior was Spartan: a small stove, a rough-hewn table, and a narrow cot, but it was shelter from the storm. Kyle laid Sarah gently on the cot and quickly set about starting a fire in the small stove. His fingers were nearly useless from cold, but he managed to get a flame going using the dry kindling stored beside the stove. As warmth gradually filled the small space, Kyle turned his attention back to Sarah. She was still unconscious, her breathing shallow but steady. Kyle removed his gloves with his teeth and gently touched her face. Her skin was ice cold. Frostbite was a real danger, and he needed to warm her carefully. Using water from his canteen, Kyle cleaned the wound on her temple. It wasn't deep, but head injuries could be deceptive. He checked her limbs for breaks, relieved to find none, though her right shoulder seemed swollen, possibly dislocated. As the shack warmed, Kyle removed his coat and wrapped it around Sarah, along with every blanket he could find. He chafed her hands between his, willing warmth back into her fingers. "Come on," he murmured. "Stay with me." Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the small shack, Kyle maintained his vigil. He spoke to her softly, telling her about his travels, the interesting people he'd met, anything to fill the silence and give her something to come back to. It was nearly evening when Sarah's eyelids finally fluttered. Kyle was at her side in an instant, relief washing over him as her eyes, a startling shade of green he hadn't fully appreciated before, opened and tried to focus. "Easy now," he said softly. "You're safe." Sarah's brow furrowed in confusion. Her lips moved, but no sound emerged. Kyle quickly brought a cup of water to her lips, supporting her head as she drank. "The cabin," she managed to whisper after a moment, her voice rough. "It collapsed," Kyle nodded. "I found you buried in the snow. Brought you here to wait out the storm." Recognition dawned slowly in her eyes. "You're the mail carrier Dawson, Kyle Dawson," he confirmed with a slight smile. "We met last spring when I delivered that package to your father." A shadow passed over his face. "Is he?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "He died last summer, pneumonia. It's been just me since then." Kyle's heart ached for her, alone in these mountains for months, and now this. "I'm sorry," he said simply. Sarah tried to sit up but gasped in pain, her hand going to her shoulder. "Careful," Kyle cautioned, gently easing her back down. "I think your shoulder's dislocated. I can set it, but it's going to hurt something fierce." Sarah's jaw set in determination. "Do it." Kyle admired her courage. Most men he knew would be cursing and carrying on with such an injury. He positioned himself carefully, explaining what he was about to do. On three, he said, gripping her arm firmly. One, he moved suddenly, popping the joint back into place. Sarah's scream was cut short as she bit down on her lip, tears streaming down her face. Kyle quickly fashioned a sling from a spare shirt, securing her arm. You said on three, she accused breathlessly. Always better when you're not tensed up waiting for it, Kyle replied with an apologetic smile. My pa taught me that trick. A ghost of a smile touched Sarah's lips despite the pain. Sneaky. Kyle helped her drink more water, then offered her some jerky from his provisions. It's not much, but we need to keep your strength up. As Sarah ate, Kyle explained their situation, the continuing storm, the remote location, and his plan to get them to safety once the weather cleared. Your cabin's gone, he said gently, but I'll help you figure something out when we get to town. Sarah's eyes clouded with grief. Everything I had was in that cabin. My father's things, our supplies, everything. We'll go back when it's safe, Kyle promised. See what we can salvage. The storm showed no signs of abating as night fell. Kyle maintained the fire, occasionally stepping outside to check on Thunder, who was sheltered in a lean-to behind the shack. Sarah drifted in and out of sleep, her body fighting to recover from trauma and exposure. Kyle found himself watching her in the firelight, struck by her resilience. Most women he knew would have been hysterical after such an ordeal, but Sarah bore her pain with quiet dignity. As the night deepened, Kyle settled himself on the floor near the stove, his back against the wall. He intended to stay awake to keep watch, but exhaustion finally claimed him. He woke to find Sarah trying to rise from the cot, her face pale with effort. Whoa there, he said, quickly moving to her side. What do you need? I'm not helpless, she replied, her voice stronger than it had been the previous evening. Just sore and, she hesitated. In need of some privacy, understanding dawned on Kyle's face. Of course, let me help you to the door at least. With his support, Sarah made it outside, where Kyle left her with a respectful distance while remaining close enough to assist if needed. The storm had diminished somewhat overnight, though snow still fell steadily. Back inside, Kyle added more wood to the stove and set about making coffee using his small pot and the supplies he carried in his saddlebags. How long have you been delivering mail? Sarah asked as she sipped the strong brew, color returning to her cheeks. About 5 years now, Kyle replied, settling across from her. Before that, I worked cattle drives mostly, tried my hand at mining for a spell, but didn't take to it. You must see a lot of the territory, Kyle nodded. More than most. Gets lonely sometimes, but I like the freedom of it. I understand lonely, Sarah said quietly. Their conversation flowed easily as the day progressed. Kyle learned that Sarah had come west with her father 3 years ago after her mother's death. They'd built the cabin together, learning to survive in the harsh Montana wilderness. Pa was determined to make a new start, she explained. He'd been a carpenter back in Pennsylvania, but after Ma died, he couldn't stand to be in the same place anymore. And you just followed along. Kyle asked, curious about the young woman who'd willingly left civilization for this remote existence. Sarah gave a small shrug with her good shoulder. He was all I had left, and I'd always loved adventure stories, thought this would be like living in one. A rueful smile crossed her face. It was harder than I imagined, but I came to love it in my own way. As Sarah spoke, Kyle found himself increasingly drawn to her. She wasn't just beautiful, though she certainly was that, with her auburn hair and expressive green eyes, but there was a strength to her that he admired. A self-sufficiency rare in women of his acquaintance. By evening, the storm had finally begun to dissipate. Kyle stepped outside to check the conditions, finding the sky clearing to reveal a canopy of stars. The temperature had dropped further with the clear skies, but the brutal wind had died down. We should be able to make it to Silverline Creek tomorrow, he told Sarah when he returned. It's about 15 miles, but Thunder can manage it if we take it slow. Sarah nodded, though anxiety flickered across her face. What then? I have no money, no supplies, nothing. First things first, Kyle said firmly. We get you to a doctor to check that head wound and shoulder properly. After that, well, folks in Silverline look after their own. They'll help. I'm not charity, Sarah said, her chin lifting. Kyle's respect for her deepened. No, you're not. You're a survivor, and from what you've told me about your carpentry skills, you've got plenty to offer." The next morning dawned clear and blindingly bright, the sun reflecting off the pristine snow. Kyle helped Sarah onto Thunder, then mounted behind her. The close proximity made him acutely aware of her, the scent of her hair, the way she fit against him. "Ready?" he asked, his voice surprisingly husky. Sarah nodded, and Kyle guided Thunder out into the snow-covered landscape. The going was slow, the horse having to navigate drifts that sometimes reached his chest. Kyle kept one arm securely around Sarah's waist, conscious of her injured shoulder. As they rode, the vastness of the Montana wilderness stretched around them, snow-covered peaks rising against the impossibly blue sky, forests of pine standing sentinel on the slopes. Despite the hardships, Kyle couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at the beauty. "It's like the whole world has been made new," Sarah murmured, echoing his thoughts. They paused at midday to rest the horse and eat a meager lunch of the last of Kyle's provisions. As they prepared to continue, Kyle noticed Sarah shivering despite the layers of clothing. "We need to keep moving," he said with concern. "Can't risk you getting too cold." Sarah nodded, her teeth chattering. "I'm all right, just need to get moving again." But as they continued their journey, Kyle could feel Sarah's body growing increasingly tense against his. Her breathing became labored, and when he touched her face, her skin burned with fever. "Sarah," alarm sharpened his voice. "Talk to me, just tired," she mumbled, her words slurring slightly. "Need to rest a bit," Kyle cursed under his breath. The head wound, the exposure, the shock to her system, they were taking their toll. They needed to reach town quickly, but pushing Thunder any harder in these conditions risked the horse foundering in the deep snow. "Stay with me," Kyle urged, his arm tightening around her waist. "Tell me about Pennsylvania. What was it like where you grew up?" He kept her talking as they rode, asking questions whenever her voice began to fade, desperate to keep her conscious. Sarah described her childhood home, the small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, the river where she'd learned to swim. The sun was low on the horizon when the first buildings of Silverline Creek came into view. Kyle had never been so grateful to see the modest settlement with its single street of wooden buildings and scattered cabins. "We made it," he told Sarah, who had grown alarmingly quiet in the last hour. "Just a little further." He urged Thunder down the main street toward the doctor's house, which stood at the far end. People emerged from buildings as they passed, curious about the arrivals, then alarmed at the sight of Sarah slumped against Kyle, Doctor. William Porter was already on his porch as they approached, alerted by the commotion. A tall man with a salt and pepper beard, he quickly assessed the situation as Kyle brought Thunder to a halt. "Bring her in," he directed, helping Kyle lift Sarah from the saddle. Inside the doctor's house, warmth enveloped them. Dr. Porter led them to a small examination room where Kyle gently laid Sarah on the table. "What happened?" the doctor asked, already checking her pulse. Kyle quickly explained about the cabin collapse, the dislocated shoulder, and the head wound. She seemed to be improving, but on the ride here, she developed a fever. Dr. Porter nodded grimly as he examined the wound on Sarah's temple. "Possible infection, and I'm concerned about the head injury. She's showing signs of concussion." Kyle stepped back as the doctor worked, his heart clenched with worry. He hadn't realized until this moment how much he'd come to care for Sarah in their short time together. "You should get some rest yourself," Dr. Porter said, glancing at Kyle. "Mrs. Holloway's boarding house is just down the street. I'll send word if there's any change." Kyle shook his head. "I'd prefer to stay if you don't mind." The doctor gave him a knowing look but didn't argue. "Suit yourself. There's coffee in the kitchen." Through the night, Kyle sat vigil beside Sarah's bed, where Dr. Porter had moved her after treating her wounds. The doctor had cleaned and redressed the head injury, properly secured her shoulder, and administered medicine for the fever. Now it was a waiting game. Kyle dozed fitfully in a chair, waking at every small sound. Toward dawn, he opened his eyes to find Sarah watching him, her gaze clearer than it had been the previous evening. "You stayed," she said softly, relief flooded through Kyle. "Course I did, doctor." Porter, alerted by their voices, entered to check on his patient. After a thorough examination, he pronounced her improving, though not out of danger. "The fever's down, but we need to watch for any signs of worsening," he explained. "Head injuries can be unpredictable." Over the next 3 days, Kyle remained a constant presence at Sarah's bedside. He left only to care for Thunder and arrange for repairs to his tack at the local saddlery. The rest of the time, he sat with Sarah, talking, reading to her from the doctor's small collection of books, or simply keeping her company as she regained her strength. Word of Sarah's situation spread quickly through Silverline Creek. The small community responded with characteristic generosity. Women arrived with home-cooked meals. Men offered assistance in salvaging what they could from her cabin once the snow melted enough to make the journey possible. Maggie Thornton, the widow who ran the general store, appeared on the second day with a bundle of clothing. "These belonged to my daughter before she married and moved to Oregon," she explained. "She's about your size and you're welcome to them." Sarah was overwhelmed by the kindness. "I don't know how I'll ever repay everyone," she said to Kyle after Maggie had left. "That's not how it works out here," Kyle replied. "People help because someday they might need helping themselves. It's how we all survive." On the 4th day, Dr. Porter declared Sarah well enough to leave his care, though she still needed rest and careful monitoring. "She shouldn't be alone," the doctor told Kyle privately. "That shoulder will take weeks to heal properly, and I want to keep an eye on her recovery from the head injury." "Mrs. Holloway has a room," Kyle suggested. "I can pay for it until Sarah's back on her feet." The doctor nodded approvingly. "That would be suitable. Mrs. Holloway's a fine nurse in her own right, used to assist her husband before he passed." That afternoon, Kyle escorted Sarah to the boarding house, where Mrs. Holloway, a plump, cheerful woman in her 60s, welcomed them warmly. "I've got the corner room all ready," she announced, leading the way up a narrow staircase. "Gets the morning sun, which is just what you need to build your strength, my dear." The room was small but comfortable, with a brass bed, a dresser, and a rocking chair by the window that overlooked the main street. Someone had placed a vase of dried wildflowers on the dresser, a touch of brightness in the winter gloom. "It's lovely," Sarah said sincerely. "Thank you." After Mrs. Holloway had left, promising tea in an hour, Sarah turned to Kyle. "You didn't have to do this." Kyle shifted uncomfortably. "Couldn't just leave you with nowhere to go." "No, I suppose your conscience wouldn't allow that," Sarah said with a small smile. "But your duty's discharged now, Mr. Dawson. You've delivered me safely to town." Kyle felt an unexpected pang at her formal tone. "It's not about duty." Sarah's gaze softened. "Then what is it about?" Before Kyle could answer, Mrs. Holloway called up the stairs that tea was ready. The moment passed, leaving Kyle with a tangle of unspoken feelings. Over the next week, Kyle found reasons to remain in Silverline Creek, despite knowing his mail route was falling behind. He took odd jobs around town helping the blacksmith, assisting with repairs at the church, anything to earn enough to extend his stay. Each day, he visited Sarah, watching with satisfaction as color returned to her cheeks and strength to her movements. They fell into a comfortable routine of shared meals and long conversations. Kyle found himself opening up to her in ways he never had with anyone before, telling her about his childhood in Kansas, his dreams of someday having a place of his own. "Not a big spread," he explained as they sat on Mrs. Holloway's porch one surprisingly mild afternoon. "Just enough land for a decent garden, some cattle, maybe a few horses to raise." "It sounds wonderful," Sarah said, her eyes distant with her own dreams. "I always thought I'd have a home like that someday, before your father brought you out here." Kyle prompted gently when she trailed off. Sarah nodded. "It was his dream, not mine, but I learned to love it in my own way." "And now," Sarah's gaze met his, "now I'm not sure what comes next. I can't go back to that mountain, not alone." The unspoken question hung between them. What would she do instead? Kyle wanted to suggest a solution, but something held him back. It was too soon, he told himself. She was still recovering, still grieving the loss of her home and possessions. As Sarah's health improved, Kyle knew he couldn't delay his duties any longer. The mail route wouldn't wait forever, and the postmaster in Butt had already sent a telegram inquiring about his extended absence. "I have to leave tomorrow," he told Sarah over dinner at the small cafe that served as Silverline Creek's only restaurant. "Got routes that need covering." Sarah nodded, her expression carefully neutral. "Of course, you've already stayed far longer than you should have." "I'll be back this way in about 2 weeks," Kyle added quickly. "3 at the most, Mr. Dawson." "Kyle," Sarah said, setting down her fork, "you don't owe me anything more. You saved my life, found me a place to stay. That's more than most would do for a stranger." "You're not a stranger," Kyle replied, more forcefully than he'd intended. "Not anymore." A flush rose to Sarah's cheeks. "What am I, then?" Kyle struggled for words. How could he explain what she'd come to mean to him in such a short time? How the thought of leaving her behind tied his stomach in knots. "A friend," he said finally, though the word felt inadequate. "Someone I care about." Sarah's eyes softened, but before she could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Thomas, who pulled up a chair to discuss plans for salvaging what they could from Sarah's cabin once the snow levels permitted. The moment was lost, and Kyle departed the next morning with many things left unsaid. Sarah stood on Mrs. Holloway's porch to see him off, her arm still in a sling but her stance stronger than it had been days before. "Be safe out there," she said as he mounted Thunder. "Always am," Kyle replied with a forced lightness. "Got more reason to be careful now." Sarah's smile was worth the hundreds of miles he knew lay ahead of him. As he rode out of Silverline Creek, Kyle found himself already counting the days until he could return. The mail route was punishing after his time in Silverline Creek. Kyle pushed himself and Thunder hard, determined to make up for lost time and perhaps shorten his return journey if possible. He rode through late winter storms, forded swollen creeks, and navigated trails made treacherous by melting snow. At night, camped beside small fires or in rustic waypoints along his route, Kyle found his thoughts continually returning to Sarah. He wondered how her recovery was progressing, whether she'd made decisions about her future, if she thought of him as often as he thought of her. In Butt, the postmaster grumbled about Kyle's extended absence, but was mollified by his dedication in completing the backlogged deliveries in record time. Kyle took on extra routes, working from dawn until dusk, driven by the desire to finish his circuit and return to Silverline Creek as quickly as possible. It was 17 days later when Kyle finally guided Thunder down the main street of Silverline Creek once more. The settlement looked different in the early spring thaw, muddier, busier, with the promise of new life in the budding trees and the first green shoots pushing through the melting snow. His heart quickened as he approached Mrs. Holloway's boarding house. Would Sarah still be there? Would she welcome his return, or had she moved on somehow in his absence? Kyle's questions were answered as he dismounted in front of the general store. The door opened, and Sarah emerged, her arm no longer in a sling, a basket of supplies on her other arm. She stopped short when she saw him, her eyes widening in surprise, then crinkling at the corners as she smiled. "You're back," she said simply. "Told you I would be," Kyle replied, his voice rough with emotion. Sarah's smile widened. "Yes, you did. I've come to learn that Kyle Dawson keeps his promises." There was something different about her, a new confidence in her bearing, a certainty that hadn't been there before. Kyle noticed she was wearing a new dress, blue calico that brought out the color of her eyes. "You look well," he observed, suddenly aware of his own trail-worn appearance. "I am," Sarah confirmed. "Dr. Porter says I'm fully recovered, and I have news." She gestured toward the building across the street, a small storefront that had been vacant when Kyle left. "I'm opening a furniture shop." Kyle blinked in surprise. "A furniture shop?" Sarah nodded eagerly. "My father taught me everything he knew about carpentry. It turns out Mr. Thornton, Maggie's brother-in-law, has been looking for someone to take over his workshop since his hands got too bad with arthritis. He's agreed to let me use his tools and space until I can afford my own." Pride swelled in Kyle's chest. "Sarah, that's wonderful. Several people have already commissioned pieces," she continued, clearly excited. "Seems there's more need for skilled woodworking than I realized." As they talked, Kyle noticed people passing by greeted Sarah warmly, many stopping to ask about specific orders or to welcome her to the community. In just over 2 weeks, she had become a part of Silverline Creek in a way that both impressed and slightly intimidated Kyle. "You've been busy," he observed as they walked toward Mrs. Holloway's, where Kyle had taken a room for his stay. Sarah nodded. "It kept me from thinking too much about—" She hesitated. "About everything that happened and about when you might return." The simple admission sent warmth spreading through Kyle's chest. "I thought about you too," he said quietly. "Every day." That evening, they sat on Mrs. Holloway's porch after dinner, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Sarah told Kyle more about her plans for the furniture business, while he shared stories from his recent travels. "Will you go back to the cabin site?" Kyle asked eventually. Sarah nodded. "Sheriff Thomas and some men are organizing a trip next week, now that the snow's melted enough. There might be some things worth salvaging." "I'd like to go with you," Kyle offered, "if that's all right." Sarah's hand found his on the arm of the rocking chair. "I'd like that," she said softly. The journey to Sarah's mountain cabin a week later was considerably easier than their desperate flight had been. Spring was asserting itself more confidently now, with wildflowers beginning to carpet the meadows and the forest alive with birdsong. Sheriff Thomas led the small expedition, which included Kyle, Sarah, and 3 other men from town. They rode steadily, reaching the site of Sarah's cabin by midday. The destruction was even more complete than Kyle had remembered. The heavy snow had crushed the structure almost flat, and the subsequent melt had turned the interior into a sodden mess. Sarah dismounted slowly, her face solemn as she surveyed what remained of her home. "I knew it would be bad," she said quietly to Kyle, who had moved to stand beside her. "But seeing it like this—" Kyle placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I'm sorry, Sarah." The men set to work carefully, lifting fallen beams and sorting through the debris. To everyone's surprise, they managed to recover more than expected. Sarah's father's tool chest had survived, protected by a fallen section of roof that had created a pocket of space. Several books, though water-damaged, were salvageable. A tin box contained family photographs and letters, their contents remarkably preserved. Perhaps most significant was the discovery of a small leather pouch hidden in a secret compartment of what had been Sarah's father's bed frame. Inside were 20 gold double eagles, a fortune that Sarah hadn't known existed. "Pa always said to save for hard times," she whispered, tears in her eyes as she held the coins. "I never knew he had this much put aside." Kyle smiled, genuinely happy for her. "Changes things a bit, doesn't it?" Sarah nodded, closing her fingers around the coins. "It means I can buy my own tools, my own shop space when the time is right." She looked up at Kyle, her eyes bright with possibilities. "It means I have choices now." As they prepared to leave, Sarah stood for a long moment, gazing at the ruins of the cabin. Kyle waited respectfully a few paces behind her, understanding her need for a private farewell. When she finally turned away, there was a serenity in her expression that touched Kyle deeply. "Ready?" he asked. Sarah nodded. "I'm ready to go home." The word home lingered between them as they mounted their horses. Silverline Creek was becoming that for Sarah. Kyle realized a place of new beginnings. Back in town, Sarah threw herself into her furniture business with renewed energy. The gold coins provided security, but she was determined to succeed on her own merits. Kyle watched with admiration as she worked alongside Mr. Thornton, learning his techniques while incorporating her own creative touches. Kyle extended his stay in Silverline Creek as long as possible, taking on local deliveries and helping with the spring cattle drive for a nearby ranch. Each day brought him and Sarah closer, their friendship deepening into something neither of them named but both increasingly acknowledged through small gestures, a lingering touch. A special smile saved only for each other, the way they sought one another's company even in a crowded room. As April turned to May, however, Kyle could no longer delay his return to the main mail route. The night before his departure, he invited Sarah to dinner at the cafe, determined to speak the words that had been building in his heart. The cafe owner, sensing the occasion was special, provided them with a corner table adorned with a clean cloth and a small vase of fresh wildflowers. Sarah arrived wearing a new dress of soft green that made her eyes sparkle like sun-dappled leaves. "You look beautiful," Kyle said simply as he held her chair. Sarah blushed prettily. "Thank you. Mrs. Holloway helped me with the alterations." Their conversation flowed easily through the meal, but Kyle could feel an undercurrent of tension, the awareness that tomorrow would bring separation once more. Finally, as they lingered over coffee, Kyle gathered his courage. "Sarah, I've been thinking a lot about the future." Sarah's fingers tightened around her cup. "Have you?" Kyle nodded, suddenly finding it difficult to meet her gaze. "The thing is, I like what I do, being on the trail, seeing new places, but lately, I've been thinking it might be nice to have somewhere to come back to, someone to come back to." Sarah's breath caught audibly. "Kyle, I'm not asking for promises," he hurried on. "It's too soon for that, I know, but I want you to know that what I feel for you is real, and if you might someday feel the same." "I already do," Sarah interrupted softly. Kyle's head jerked up, hope blazing in his chest. "You do?" Sarah nodded, her eyes shining with emotion. "How could I not? You saved my life, Kyle, but more than that, you've shown me what kind of man you are: kind, honorable, someone I can trust, someone I've come to care for very deeply." Kyle reached across the table to take her hand. "I don't want to rush you, Sarah. You're building a new life here, and I respect that, but maybe when you're ready, we could think about building one together." Sarah's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. "I'd like that very much." The following morning, their goodbye was different from the last, filled with promise rather than uncertainty. Kyle kissed Sarah for the first time on Mrs. Holloway's porch, a gentle press of lips that conveyed more than words could express. 2 weeks, he promised. "I'll be back in 2 weeks." Sarah nodded, her hand lingering on his cheek. "I'll be here." As spring bloomed into summer, Kyle and Sarah settled into a rhythm dictated by his mail route. He would be gone for 2 to 3 weeks, then return to Silverline Creek for 5 or 6 days before departing again. The reunions were joyous, the partings bittersweet but eased by the certainty of return. Sarah's furniture business flourished. Her pieces, known for their beauty and craftsmanship, were soon in demand beyond Silverline Creek. She hired a young apprentice, the blacksmith's son, who showed a natural aptitude for woodworking. In July, Kyle returned from his route to find Sarah had purchased a small house at the edge of town, a modest structure with 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a real cast iron stove, and a workshop out back. "It needs work," she admitted as she showed him through the rooms, "but the bones are good and the price was right." Kyle wandered through the space, seeing not what it was but what it could become. "It's perfect," he declared. "A real home." Sarah watched him carefully. "I hoped you'd like it." Kyle turned to her, understanding dawning. "Sarah, are you asking me to share it with me?" she finished for him. "When you're here at first, and maybe someday if the mail route becomes less appealing." Kyle closed the distance between them in 2 strides, gathering her in his arms. "Yes," he said simply. "Yes to all of it." They were married in September, when the aspens had turned to gold and the air carried the first hints of autumn crispness. The ceremony was held in Silverline Creek's small church, with the entire town turning out to celebrate. Mrs. Holloway wept openly, declaring she'd known all along they were perfect for each other. Dr. Porter, who gave the bride away, beamed with paternal pride. Kyle arranged his routes to allow for a week's honeymoon, a trip to a small cabin on the shores of a mountain lake that a grateful customer had offered to Sarah in exchange for a dining table. They spent the days exploring the surrounding wilderness and the nights exploring each other, discovering the joy of physical intimacy that matched the emotional connection they'd built. As winter approached once more, Kyle found himself increasingly reluctant to leave on his mail routes. The house Sarah had transformed into their home called to him like a beacon when he was away. More than once, he urged Thunder to a faster pace as Silverline Creek came into view, eager to cross the final distance. It was during the first heavy snow of the season that Kyle made his decision. He had been fighting through a blizzard reminiscent of the one that had brought him and Sarah together, and the memory of her trapped beneath the collapsed cabin haunted him as he struggled through the drifts. When he finally reached Silverline Creek, half frozen and exhausted, Sarah was waiting at their door, her face tight with worry. "I thought you weren't coming," she said as she helped him remove his ice-encrusted coat. "The storm's been raging for days." Kyle pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. "I'll always come back to you," he promised, "but I've been thinking it might be time for a change." Sarah pulled back to look at him questioningly. "What kind of change?" "The kind where I'm not gone for weeks at a time," Kyle replied. "Where I don't have to worry about leaving you alone through another winter." Hope dawned in Sarah's eyes. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying I want to be home with my wife," Kyle confirmed. "I've been talking with Sheriff Thomas. Seems the town's growing enough that he could use a deputy, especially one who knows the territory as well as I do." Sarah's face lit with joy. "You'd be perfect for that." "It would mean less money, at least at first," Kyle cautioned. Sarah laughed. "Kyle Dawson, do you think I married you for your salary as a mail carrier? We have my business, your new position, and if times get tight, we have my father's gold. We'll be fine." Kyle kissed her then, marveling at how completely this woman had changed his life in less than a year. From the moment he dug her from the snow, saying those simple words, "You're breathing," that's enough. His path had altered in ways he could never have imagined. By Christmas, Kyle had officially retired from the mail service and pinned on a deputy's badge. The transition wasn't without challenges. He missed the solitude of the trail sometimes, the freedom to move with the rhythms of nature rather than the demands of a growing town. But the joy of returning each night to Sarah, of building a life together day by day, far outweighed what he had left behind. They celebrated their first Christmas in their home with a small gathering of friends who had become like family. Mrs. Holloway, Dr. Porter, Sheriff and Mrs. Thomas, and others who had helped Sarah establish herself in Silverline Creek. The house glowed with warmth and laughter, the table laden with holiday dishes contributed by everyone present. As the evening wound down and their guests departed, Kyle and Sarah stood on their porch, watching snow fall gently in the lantern light. Kyle's arm was wrapped securely around his wife's waist, her head resting on his shoulder. "Happy?" he asked softly. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the same love he felt expanding in his own heart. "More than I ever thought possible." As they turned to go inside, Kyle paused, glancing up at the sturdy roof above them. "Promise me something?" Sarah raised an eyebrow questioningly. "If this roof ever starts to give way under the snow, you'll get out immediately," he said, only half joking. Sarah laughed, the sound as bright as sleigh bells in the winter night. "I promise. Though I have to admit, being dug out by a handsome cowboy worked out rather well for me in the end." Kyle grinned, pulling her close once more. "For both of us, Mrs. Dawson, for both of us." The years that followed brought changes to Silverline Creek and to Kyle and Sarah's lives. The town grew steadily as the railroad pushed further west, bringing new opportunities and challenges. Kyle eventually became sheriff when Thomas retired, his fair-minded approach to law enforcement earning him the respect of even the roughest elements that passed through. Sarah's furniture business expanded to include a proper storefront on the main street, where she sold not only her own creations but those of her apprentices, who now numbered 3. Her reputation spread throughout the territory, bringing commissions from as far away as Helena and Bozeman. In the spring of 1882, their family grew with the birth of their first child, a daughter they named Eleanor, after Sarah's mother. Kyle discovered depths of love he hadn't known existed as he held his tiny daughter, her small hand wrapped around his weathered finger. "She has your eyes," Sarah observed from the bed, exhausted but radiant after the birth. "And your spirit, I'd wager," Kyle replied, carefully returning the baby to her mother's arms. "Heaven help us when she starts walking." Their son, James, followed 2 years later, as strong-willed and adventurous as his sister was thoughtful and careful. The children filled their home with laughter and occasional chaos, transforming Kyle and Sarah's lives in wonderful, exhausting ways. Through it all, the bond between Kyle and Sarah deepened and strengthened. The trials they faced, from harsh winters to a diphtheria outbreak that nearly claimed James, from economic downturns to the challenges of raising spirited children, only served to reinforce what they had recognized in each other from the beginning. A matching resilience, a shared determination to build a good life no matter what obstacles arose. On the 10th anniversary of the day Kyle had found Sarah beneath her collapsed cabin, they returned to the mountain where it had happened. The site was hardly recognizable now nature had reclaimed it thoroughly, with young pines growing where the cabin had once stood. "It seems like another lifetime," Sarah mused as they stood hand in hand, looking over the peaceful clearing. Kyle squeezed her fingers gently. "In some ways it was. I was a different man before I found you." Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder, a familiar gesture that still brought warmth to Kyle's heart. "I was thinking this morning about what you said when you pulled me from the snow. That you were breathing, and it was enough," Kyle recalled. Sarah nodded. "It was more than enough." "It was a beginning." She turned to face him, her green eyes as bright and clear as they had been on that first day, though now framed by fine lines that Kyle found only enhanced her beauty. "Thank you for finding me, Kyle Dawson." Kyle cupped her face in his hands, overcome with gratitude for the life they had built together. "Best thing I ever did," he said simply, and kissed her as the mountain wind whispered through the pines, carrying the promise of many more years to come.